Hi, I'm Matthew Weber from the University of Minnesota. I'm an associate professor in the Hubbard School of Journalism and Mass Communication, and it's an honor to be joining you today to give this keynote as part of the WorkNet kickoff meeting. I truly wish that we'd all been able to join in person for this conversation, but given the circumstances, I'm happy to be joining you from my basement to share my talk today, Web Archives, a critical method for the future of digital research. This is a talk that's near and dear to my heart and to the career of research that I've built up over the past decade plus, as web archives have really been a core component of the research that I've been working on. Now, I often use the analogy of wishing I had a magic 8-ball when I talk about web archives. And the reason for that is that if I go back to the beginning of my academic career, to around 2009, go back to an opportunity I had to join a research meeting at Oxford University, where I was able to talk about my interests in studying news media. Now, I came into academia from the media industry where I worked in marketing, and I was driven to pursue a career in academia in large part because of an ongoing interest to better understand the way in which media companies really failed wholeheartedly to grasp and to adapt to the power of digital technology. And so I was at this meeting in 2009 talking about my dissertation proposal, and I was remarking on the fact that it was such a hard topic to study because I didn't have a magic 8-ball to go back in time to look at what the internet looked like. And it happened that at this conference, which was really focused on digital methodology and digital scholarship, someone was in attendance who happened to be, at the time, then lead of research at the Internet Archive. And so at a reception later in the evening, that woman pulled me aside and had a conversation with me and started talking to me about the Internet Archive and its potential as a research tool. This was early in the trajectory of the utilization of web archives as a research tool. And so there really weren't the means for extracting the data in the way that I wanted to. And so through the course of my dissertation and through the course of my early career, I spent a lot of time developing ways to extract the data that I wanted to work with in order to study what the web had looked like during the formative days of news media's experimentation with web technology. Now, today, that story has changed dramatically, in large part due to the work of many of us who are gathering for this convening. And I thought it was notable and worth remarking on the way in which this proposal was brought together and some of the text that was put into this proposal. In particular, I was struck by one sentence that I came across in which the proposal noted, to fully understand some of the most pressing issues of today's society and the recent societies and their recent historical developments, a pivotal component, the web, has to be unlocked. And I think that really gets at the heart of what I want to talk about today, which is this idea of web archive as a research method, really pointing to the fact that we have come far enough as a community of researchers that we need to begin thinking about what it means to establish this as a true method for research, tool that becomes something that involves systematic planning for the purposes of conducting research. And so in thinking about this, I went back to some of the fundamental texts, the foundational texts that I've come across in my career for thinking about research and methodology, and came back to this idea of needing to, as a researcher, think about what a definable problem is that you are going to address in your scholarship, and then also needing to select the appropriate method in order to conduct that research. And as I think about the way in which web archiving is evolving and is maturing as an area of research, I think it really is starting to develop and emerge as something that we can begin to treat as a method for scholarship, method for research across domains. And so today, in talking about web archive as a method for research, I'm going to focus on talking about some of the challenges for an emerging method. I'm going to talk about the need to continue to build a knowledge base for web archiving. I'm going to talk about some of the ways in which we've already built that knowledge base. I'm going to talk about the importance of accessibility and scalability. I'm going to give you a few examples from my own work, some of the ways in which I started to address those issues. I'm going to talk about ways in which, as a method, you develop intersections with existing domains of research that may utilize this method for their own scholarship. And finally, I'll close by talking about the need for establishing validity and reliability with regards to web archiving as a method. So to begin with, and just in looking back the period from 2010 to 2020, it is notable in the ways in which we have built up a knowledge base for web archiving. And that knowledge base is something that stretches across domains. And so in thinking about what I was going to say to you today, I went back to the Web of Science and ran queries related to web archiving and internet archiving in order to see the various journals and the various conferences in which we as a community are publishing. And the breadth of scholarship is remarkable in the way in which it's developed. The number of journals and the disciplines that we're touching on, from management to humanities to the social sciences, the conferences, the international conferences like the Association of Internet Researchers, my own discipline, the International Communication Association, the many related digital humanities conferences, where we see web archiving starting to emerge as a theme and a topic for discussion, as a method that is utilized in the research that is presented at these conferences. Similarly, if we go and look at the publications that are occurring year by year, and we look back here in the Web of Science trends in terms of the mentions in titles and abstracts of internet archiving and web archiving, we see from 1996 through to 2018, 2019, a remarkable growth in terms of the count of articles. Now, there's a little bit of a dip here in 2019, 2020, and in part that's simply a delay in the indexing of some articles that will likely increase those two bars. And so overall, we do see this remarkable and steady growth in terms of publications related to web archiving. And we see remarkable breadth in terms of the disciplines that are talking about this topic and utilizing data from web archives, from computer science to information science to astrology to imaging intelligence and artificial intelligence research. Internet archive and web archive data is utilized in many different ways. Notably, web archiving is becoming a method and a means of data collection that is no longer necessarily about the past. And by that, I mean that when I go to conferences in my core discipline of communication and I talk about web archiving, there's a preconceived notion that I'm immediately going to start talking about data from 10 to 15 years ago. And while that often may be the case, and we may find significant utility in being able to go back that far, it is increasingly the case that we're able to talk with web archives about data that was collected yesterday. And so I think a particularly salient example of this are the web archiving efforts that have been spun up in order to record the ways in which information has been disseminated online with regards to information about coronavirus or COVID-19. So in particular here, I'm showing an example of the United States National Library of Medicine's Global Health Events Archive, which is an ongoing project in partnership with Archive.it to build near real-time archives around critical health events. And this is a project that dates back to 2014, but one in which the National Library of Medicine and the National Institutes of Health have used to focus and to archive content related to coronavirus. This has previously been used to track information related to pandemic, or I shouldn't say pandemic, disease outbreaks such as Ebola and Zika virus, but is now being used to track COVID-19 related content. Similarly, across the Internet Archive and Archive.it's efforts related to coronavirus, there are more than 150 active archiving efforts right now focused on collecting data related to coronavirus. And so the point in this is that in thinking about web archiving, it's important to remember and to promote to the broader research communities that we connect with the ways in which this method is being used now to create near real-time data sets, and arguably more real-time than other relevant methods that we could be using to collect data and to build up these data sets. Similarly, we have notable national efforts outside of the United States, efforts that many of you are intimately familiar with, to build accessible data sets and comprehensive data sets, tracking the history of entire countries. Here we have the Portuguese archive and some of their notable research efforts that have come out of this. Obviously, Net Archive and Danish National Archive is a fantastic example of not only what a national archive can look like, but what types of research programs can be built that layer on top of and layer into and integrate with those web archiving efforts. Now, simultaneously with the increasing scale of web archiving and the increasing way in which some of these archives are made accessible either through Archive or through the national platforms, there are additional tools that are being created that allow either for data collection. And so tools like Memento are fantastic examples of tools that allow individuals and individual research groups the ability to create their own archives and to collect data in ways that are meaningful and unique to their own individual needs. But we're also seeing significant effort being put into the creation of tools that enable research in the space. And so one example is particularly relevant here is Archives Unleashed and the Archives Unleashed Cloud project. One being more of a back-end code-based project, and the Archives Unleashed Cloud component of that project being a graphic user interface, both of which help to improve the way in which researchers are able to access web archive content. These tools are a critical component of building up the legitimacy of web archiving as a method. Hand in hand with the tool development, projects like Archives Unleashed have built up a significant education component that help to educate scholars about ways in which they can utilize these data in their research projects. And so hand in hand with that, we do start to see significant research efforts building out and emerging and evolving as the education, as the accessibility and the scalability increases. I point here to the .uk web domain research and some of the work that's come out of the British Library and their research efforts. But I could also point to many of you who are attending and participating in this WorkNet effort as examples of ways in which we are collectively building a notable body of research demonstrating the applicability of web research and web archiving to host a whole host of research domains. And so in that spirit, I'm going to borrow from a domain of research that refers to itself as web science, very much integrated with and related to computational social science. But I borrow from web science because they have this diagram that many who talk about web science use to describe the heart of the web science community. And so web science, or the study of the social science, computer science of the web, talks about itself as being this interdisciplinary space that sits at the middle of a whole host of disciplines: sociology, biology, ecology, psychology, computer science, economics, law, social sciences, media studies, journalism studies, and makes this point that each of these domains, each of these disciplines brings to bear a unique perspective that contributes to the study of web science. And so my point in pointing to this diagram and borrowing from web science is that web archiving is similarly situated at the intersection of these disciplines. And each of these disciplines contributes in a unique way to the development of web archiving as a method. In turn, web archiving as a method is something that is potentially utilized by each of these disciplines. And so there's a need not only to build the knowledge base, to build accessibility, to build scalability, but to recognize the intersections that exist across these different domains. And it's these intersections that lie at the heart of the research that I do. I'm, by my undergrad training, an engineer. I've had a winding, twisting path as I've made my way to present day, but I've traveled through the media industry, through marketing. I have theoretical training in communication and management, and I've brought all these different perspectives to bear in my work. And at the heart of that, as a methodology, I find a home in web archiving. I find web archiving as a means for studying the ways in which, in my research, media organizations have evolved and have developed hand in hand with the technology that they interact with. I have more recently started to look at health and media and policy, which is a particularly salient topic for these times. And again, in utilizing web archiving technology to track some of the ways in which health policy is developing through the media. Now, in all of this, and in talking about web archiving as a method, I've been skipping over an important component, and I will admit a bias as I move to the next part of what I want, topic that I want to talk about. I will admit a bias as a social scientist in that in talking about methods, I talk to my students, I talk to my colleagues, and we always talk about methodology and theory needing to go hand in hand. And so forgive me for stepping on a soapbox and talking about this, but in the social sciences in particular, the humanities as well, we talk about needing a theory as a guiding lens that focuses our research and helps us to think about the method that is going to be brought to bear on the research topic that we're addressing. And so my brief tangent here is to say that in my research, I use this idea of institutional theory, which comes from sociology and is also applied in notable ways in management. And I use institutional theory as a way for looking at how collections of organizations, industries have built up over time, and how these industries that build up gain access to resources and adapt to technology. And talks about the ways in which organizations learn from one another, work with one another, compete with one another, and look for access to critical resources like knowledge about technology, people who help to run these organizations, and the people who help these organizations to adapt. And it's been a particularly useful lens for me. But it also tells me, from a theoretical point of view, that I need to know something about how the technology has been used and how it's changed over time as the organizations have changed over time. And again, this brings me back to web archiving as a way for applying my microscope to looking at media organizations. Web archiving becomes a method that allows me to develop a systematic plan for looking at media organizations as they develop. And so in the next chunk of this keynote, I'm going to focus specifically on the idea of taking this theory and taking this method and looking at local news. And I'm going to use this as a way to talk about some of the challenges of accessibility and ways in which in our research we start to overcome these challenges. And I'm going to use this topic to talk a little bit about the intersections of different research domains and hopefully show you some of the ways in which the method is coming to maturity. Local news is particularly important to me because as somebody living in the United States, we're living through a period where local communities are facing significant challenges with regards to the health of their local news environments. And I talk about this in the context of the United States, but I would be mistaken were I not to point globally and say that there are very few spots in the world today where we don't see local community news being challenged in some way, shape, or form. Even in countries where there is healthy government support for local community news, we are seeing that government support being slowly eroded bit by bit by bit, and in turn, local news being weakened bit by bit by bit. This headline that I've shared here comes from Bloomberg from 2 years ago, and this highlights reported on a study that I released in partnership with my colleague Phil Napoli at Duke University. Phil and I have been working together on the research that I'm going to talk about. This was an early study we released, and it was picked up, and the headline that came with it from the reporter was "Local News is Dying and it's Taking Small Town America with it." And the point here was that the research, the early findings from our research, pointed to this close connection between the health of communities, the vibrancy of communities, and the vibrancy of the local news ecosystem. And in part, we're seeing these changes happen because we're seeing significant changes in the political landscape and the policy landscape related to news and media in the United States, and I could argue news and media in Europe as well. We're seeing in the United States, the FCC loosening rules on local media ownership and allowing for more corporate consolidation, allowing some of these smaller local news outlets to be bought up and to be aggregated by larger media conglomerates like Gannett, like some of these central major news media organizations in the United States. And so all of this raises questions from a research perspective as to how the local news landscape is changing. And as I've suggested a number of times, web archiving provides a really apt tool for studying and for collecting the data on these local news organizations. But there's a fundamental challenge here when we try to put a pin in what is local, or what are the outlets that we need to track. We face a challenge, and we face a challenge from a methodological perspective. And that with web archiving, we need to identify the key sources that we're going to collect. We need to know what we want to archive. And yet for something like local news, we know from prior research that it's incredibly hard to identify the sources of local news within a community. And the records of local news outlets are generally pretty inadequate. They're woefully inadequate. There's not a single source that you can go to in the United States that will tell you in community X, these are the 15 local news outlets that you need to look at. And so one of our challenges in starting to think about web archiving as a method, and something that I've thought for quite a bit about, worked quite a bit on, is this idea of identifying a clear provenance for how the web archive was built, how it was constructed, and having embedded within that a clear and rigorous methodology for the websites that were archived. If we are going to bring this methodology to maturity, it's increasingly important that we be able to talk about the scale and scope of the web archiving that took place and what choices were made and why those choices were put in place. And so in our research, took the approach of taking a sample of communities across the United States. Now, in part, this was a pragmatic choice. We were limited with the funding that we had to collect data. In part, it was also intended to allow us to purposefully deep dive into communities across the United States rather than having a focus on breadth. So that focus on depth meant that we needed to select specific communities. Also gave us a geographic focus. And the geographic focus runs counter in some ways to the notion of web archiving, and that the web is often viewed as a placeless technology. But given the focus on local news, we did specifically want to capture content that was local and germane to the communities that we focused on. In this study, I focused on communities between 75,000 and 150,000 in population, and small to medium-sized communities in the United States. Had a seed list from US Census data of about 4,000 communities, of which we selected a random sample of 100. The web crawling initiated in 2016 and is ongoing to present day. We're intending to continue the web archiving in partnership with Archive.it through the upcoming presidential election in the United States. We started with what we refer to as a constructed week sample, giving us a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday from 7 consecutive weeks, drawn in random order, drawn in random order by giving us a composite week over that period. and have continued to crawl in a constructed fashion in order to build the archive, sampling every month and building up the depth of this web collection. One of the advantages of using this type of platform, although there are many that could be utilized, is that we do end up with a graphic interface that allows us to access specific URLs. Also gives a graphic interface that allows researchers to look at the content that was collected. And so in addition to being able to look at some of the metadata files, I myself tend to take a quantitative view of the world and work in a quantitative way. So I often work with more of the back-end data. I've actually in recent years had a number of graduate students come to me and want to work with the front-end data, work with the graphic data. So here's an example of Winona Daily News out of Winona, Minnesota. And in this example, I pulled this one because I have a number of two graduate students who have been working together to look at media framing of police violence in local news outlets, and have actually been using some search functionality of Archive It paired with the graphic accessibility to analyze the stories and conduct a content analysis paired with an analysis of the accompanying images. So simply pointing to the fact that this is a method of data collection provides a number of different ways in which research can be conducted. And then simultaneously, I've made it available through the Archive It platform and in partnership with the Internet Archive, the raw data, as well as the parse text, Watts, and Wayne named entity files, so that others are able to replicate the research that we are currently doing. That research has taken many shapes and many forms. For instance, looking broadly at the community structure and the interconnections that exist between the websites in our collection, looking at the degree distribution of connections and trying to identify communities, and finding very quickly that at the center of our cluster, at the center of my hairball diagram here, my network diagram, we find a very tight-knit cluster around Facebook's websites and Twitter, but we also find in very close proximity to that a couple of corporate clusters around entities like Gannett that provide a nexus and a connectivity point for many of the local news outlets across the 100 communities. And that's not really the focus of the research that I want to highlight for you. I want to make the point here that in using web archiving as a research method, it's not just about the web archive, it's about what we can do with the web archive. And I often find that in order to work with web archiving data, it's necessary to bring in other data points in order to complement the data that we're collecting. In this case, the analysis that was conducted here was conducted in complement with data from the US Census. I already mentioned how we utilized US Census data as a way to narrow our data collection, but we also used US Census data as a way to complement our data collection. For instance, to make sure that for each of the communities that we were looking at, we had data on community level measures, household income, density of population, distance from a large city, presence of a university, presence of a county seat, whether or not the town that we were analyzing was a state capital. Similarly, we collected community level demographics, including percent white, percent African American, and percent Hispanic Latino. And yet, we also went and conducted some secondary analyses directly utilizing the data that was collected, but working hand in hand with other related methods. In this case, working hand in hand with content analysis, at least in the initial constructed weak sample, to look at whether or not content on the front web page was original, whether the stories were local, and whether they served what our Federal Communications Commission identifies as a critical information need. In other words, identifying if the content on these front web pages was something that talked about crime, talked about education, talked about transportation, talked about community politics, talked about one of these 7 critical information needs that have been identified by the FCC as being a key need that is met by local news outlets. And that analysis was used to analyze all of the stories on the front web pages from that initial data swath across 100 communities, an analysis of approximately 7,000 news articles. What we find in that analysis is that, well, nearly half the stories that we looked at were original. Only 17% were local. 56% served a critical information need, but remember, those aren't local or original. And in fact, when we look at the trifecta of being original, local, and serving a critical information need, the analysis finds that only 11% of stories actually meet that sweet spot. So right off the bat, there's some alarm bells here and what we're able to uncover. And a really important narrative that's being pulled out because of the work we're able to do with the systematic data analysis driven by web archiving. This methodology starts to build into what has become a large multi-year study now. It's now going to enter into its 4th year. Now, I mentioned some of the secondary analysis and secondary data collection, and that allows us to do things like building hierarchical logistical regressions and multi-level models that help to get at some of the statistical findings that draw out what is actually a significant driver here, some of the trends that we see. And so I can tell you, for instance, that when we look at the production of these stories and we look at whether or not stories are local, there's very clear and strong evidence that minority communities are underserved by local content. For instance, having a high proportion of African Americans in your community leads you to have a statistically lower likelihood of having local content. Having corporate ownership of your news outlet leads you to have an even stronger likelihood of not having local content. Conversely, being in a county seat, having high household income, both lead to an increase in the likelihood that news is going to be local. The second analysis I just want to highlight briefly is whether or not content is original. And again, we see the negative impact of minority population numbers, percent African American and percent Hispanic, lead to a decrease in the production of original content. Conversely, percent white leads to an increase in the percent of original content, likelihood of original content, I should say. And corporate ownership actually leads to an increase in the production of original content. And so the interesting thing there is that if you have a corporate owner of a news outlet, you're less likely to have local content, but because these corporate owners tend to aggregate content production, they're able to produce more original stories. Now, a part of this work sought to delve deeper, and so we actually conducted interviews at a number of media outlets that were in communities that were included in this sample, and so that adds an extra level of depth here. For example, in talking to an editor from a Pennsylvania news outlet, the editor remarked, "Our operating budget was cut by 15% over 14 months. There's not much you can do when you're facing those conditions. Keep in mind the market we're in." So we're trying to do that. We have a new mandate. It doesn't leave us much choice. The result is the content that fills our pages is increasingly regional because that is our model. How do I fight that? And so now I've started to layer. I'm showing you the web archiving, the statistical analysis, and now that qualitative component that starts to tell us this very rich, multi-tiered story about what we're seeing in the web archive data that I initially collected. There are other steps that we can take here and other ways in which this initial method of data collection leads to multifaceted ways in which we can analyze and examine our data. My team has been working to develop mapping tools that allow us to look at and visualize data in a number of different ways. Here's a visualization that takes the named entity file that I talked about earlier that we have made available and gives you a set of scripts that looks at the city-states that are mentioned, cities and states that are mentioned in the web pages that were analyzed, and maps the distance between those city-states and the community for which that website was collected. And so the bigger the circle here, the less local those places are. The smaller the circle, the more local the content is. So for instance, you can see right towards the middle of the screen a very tiny dot. It's a very tiny and very local and very focused independently owned media outlet in Tennessee that covers only that community. And we can start to see that visually play out. And you notice that, for instance, the coasts and the Midwest cluster have different degrees of localness. The Midwest papers tend to be slightly more local and slightly more focused. Um, we can see trends over time from this analysis because you can extract out the data, and you can see that just even in the 2-year period that we looked at, we saw a notable uptick in the distance of stories in terms of the city-state combinations. And so we see trends over time that we're able to map. We took our data and worked with the Archives Unleashed tool set and extracted social network analysis data. And we were able to see clusters that existed in the connections between our data, and we were able to hone in and look at some of the corporate ownership and co-ownership clusters. For instance, looking here at a cluster out of Indianapolis of Gannett Company-owned newspapers, and the tight clustering that occurs between some of their national partners and some of the local media outlets. And so again, we're able to build these multi-tiers into the analysis in a very rich and meaningful way. And all of this puts a very positive spin on the potential of web archiving as a method, or I hope that you're feeling positive at this point. But I want to take a pause for a second, and I want to talk about some of the limits and some of the boundaries to web archiving as a methodology. In building a method, it's hand in hand important to say what the method can do, equally important to say what the method can't do, or where some of the limits of the method are. And so as I start to close today, I want to spend a few minutes talking about a few key challenges in utilizing web archiving as a method. So I'm first going to talk about the issue of completeness. And I'm going to lean back on a study that I conducted 6 years ago, looking at .gov data out of the United States in partnership with the Library of Congress, looked at Senate.gov and House.gov, and looked at the content in the .gov collection, but also looked at the links out to other pages. We found in looking at Senate.gov that on average there was a missing link content, 64% of the link content was missing. We looked at House.gov, which is a larger body, larger data set, and found that 75% of the link content was missing. These were links within the web pages that were archived that were broken. And so you can think about using this as a tool for research, depending on what you would want to look at. The completeness of the data set is fairly incomplete. And again, it depends specifically what you want to look at, but it's really critically important as archivists or as researchers using web archive as a method that we know and that we're aware of the limits in terms of completeness, and that we begin to develop as part of this method ways to account for that incompleteness. I don't think there's ever an expectation that a web archive is going to be complete, but there's a need to understand what is missing and how to account for that. There's a need to understand that certain elements of the web are more challenging to work with, more challenging to collect. Dynamic web content being one example. This is a page of the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, my hometown, major hometown newspaper. And here's a video clip. It's a rotating stack of video clips on the front page, and here's the archive of that. And you see that the video drops out. So some dynamic content is tricky to capture, difficult to capture. Some is near impossible to capture. Your social media newsfeed, incredibly challenging to archive using current web archiving standards. Although some efforts like Web Recorder were making strides in developing some ways to collect that data. And finally, it's important to bear in mind that the technology itself is evolving. The programming languages are evolving. I took an easy example here of Adobe Flash in 2009 and the challenges with archiving Adobe Flash. But we could also point to the challenges of archiving what people are viewing via mobile technology. I've seen recent experiments run where scholars are attempting to archive what people are seeing on their mobile phones by having them take screenshots and submit those screenshots as part of surveys that are ongoing about access to information. And it's a rudimentary form of web archiving, and it's not a systematic or methodological form of web archiving. And so in thinking about the challenges for this emerging method, establishing validity and reliability and addressing some of these problems that I've highlighted of the dynamic nature of the content, the evolving program languages, and the challenges of the completeness of these archives, it is critically important that we begin to address these limitations and be clear about what the impact of these limitations are on scholarship. Now, I remain hopeful, I remain incredibly optimistic for Web Archive research as a methodology, as a tool for research, as an increasingly appropriate method for a wide array of research questions, and as something that can be built to have a very systemic process for conducting research. And I believe that the WorkNet community in particular is one that can help to push the needle forward in this. And so I come back to my challenges for an emerging method, that we need to continue to build this knowledge base that we have established. We need to continue to increase accessibility and scalability of web archives, continue to identify, celebrate, and develop the intersections that exist with existing domains of research, and to focus on these questions of validity and reliability. In talking about web archives today, I've talked about the ways in which this method can be applied. And as you've seen, I've started to demonstrate some of the different levels, that micro level, meso level, macro level, that web archiving can speak to. And in my own work, I've talked about today communication, journalism, digital humanities, sociology, and management research, highlighting some of the different domains in which I see in my own work web archiving as a method speaking to. In closing, I'm going to leave you with the hope of my magic 8-ball 10 years later. That magic 8-ball of web archiving has helped me to study the many ways in which news media has continued to develop and evolve. It's helped me now today to begin looking at health policy through the lens of media. It's helped me to educate graduate students and to bring them into this domain of research. And so I remain incredibly hopeful about the potential and the promise of web archive research as a methodology. I'll leave you with my email address and my Twitter handle, and give quick acknowledgement to my many funding partners who have helped to support this research, including the Institute of Museum and Library Services, the Internet Archive, National Science Foundation, the Democracy Fund, Facebook. Special thanks to collaborators, Jefferson Bailey at the Internet Archive, Phil Napoli at Duke University, graduate students, Eugene Lee, Renee Mitson, Sarah K. Wiley, among others, who have helped to push this work forward. Thank you for your time. I thank you for listening to my talk, and I look forward to having the opportunity to continue this conversation.